Cool. Well, thank you all for being here, and I'm going to go ahead and again say the title of this talk. So it is a tongue twister: Cloud Native, Cost Conscious, No Compromise, Leveraging Open Source Databases in the Financial Services Industry. So my name is Lori Larusso. I am the head of community at Percona. And this is a talk that Sergey Pronin and I gave for Finos as a webinar. And Open UK was really smart in thinking, well, you should make it a panel so you can get other people's opinions. And I thought, heck yeah, let's do that. So with that being said, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll get started.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dimitri van Overbeek. I'm a solution engineer for Percona. I'm the guy on the right-hand side. Sorry, I like to live in the past, so I took a picture of 10 years ago. So essentially, my role in my organization is to listen to and talk to essentially our customers and see specifically what goals they have and how we can potentially help them achieve that. So I come regularly in contact with financial institutions, see specifically what needs they have, and also what their strategies are, and I hope to enlighten you a little bit on this.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Monica Sasso. My picture's not that old, but it's old enough. Since we're saying that, I think it's about 5 years old. Pre-pandemic. I work at Red Hat. I'm in our global financial services team. I joined about 5 years ago from the industry, so from Deutsche Bank, where I spent most of my career delivering large global digital transformation and regulatory programs. That's kind of another mouthful, another tongue twister, but hugely important. So I'm kind of a weird person to be working at Red Hat, but I love it because I kind of get to bridge the gap between the business and IT, which is incredibly important, and I think we're going to hear some of those themes come out today as we talk. But I do work a lot with our clients and partners on adopting open source technology and hybrid cloud, as well now as AI, so kind of how it all works together and making sure that it can land in a compliant manner.
So my name's Alex Kirkup. I'm a chief architect at Akamai, working on building out their cloud services and cloud products. Before that, I was a founder and built my own cloud-native company, working at the CNCF. And before that, spent many years at Goldman Sachs and Nomura doing large infrastructure projects. So a lot of experience to draw from in this panel. Not because we're old or anything.
How old is your headshot?
For doing age, mine's 2 years old. I didn't have any hair on the side of my head, and I certainly have hair there now. So it is what it is, guys. We need to update. Okay, so as we're at the State of OpenCon, I want to ask each panelist what you see as the #1 value for financial institutions to move toward using open source databases and taking them to the cloud. And since we just went down this way, let's start with Monica and go from there.
I mean, I think, can everybody hear me? Because I can't hear
This
myself.
mic is really loud.
Is this one here? No? Oh, I have to go like that? Oh gosh, like a singer, Jesus. I think it goes without saying many of the firms already use open source databases, but I think one of the conversations I typically have with customers on this is actually it's about cost mutualization. There's a huge benefit in a lot of these things. And if more than one person is using them, then everybody kind of feels safe using them. So I think anything like that where there is no real competitive advantage, why wouldn't you want to collectively develop things and make sure that you have best of breed for the industry? I think that's the right thing to do at the end of the day, right? Obviously, we're here at the State of OpenCon, but it just makes better commercial sense. And actually, it makes better cybersecurity sense as well. So I think the mutualization really, for me, is the #1 benefit.
Alex, what about you?
So I'll be honest, when I saw that question, I went, hang on, one thing? There are so many things. I think, most financial organizations would start from a cost perspective, and I think, that's typically a driver. Although I would say nowadays, it's also what those open source databases enable, right? Because a lot of the time, financial services are stuck in the past. They have a lot of legacy, and I'm pretty sure most of the financial organizations today will still be using Sybase and DB2 and Oracle and all of those things. But if they want to do something new, if they want to do vectors, if they want to do document database, if they want to do anything related to AI or elastic searches or whatever, they're going to need to look at alternatives. And I think that also comes down to the stacks that they're looking to adopt. So whether it's SaaS services or cloud services or modern tech stacks based on cloud native, there's a lot more focus on those open source databases. And to be honest, it's no longer a concern around will this work, is it reliable? They are as reliable as commercial systems, and at this stage, much more innovative.
Yeah, I agree, of course, with everything they're saying, right? So what I also often see is, as you mentioned already, the flexibility, but also the flexibility in finding people, right? So resource pools, which are much larger essentially in the open source space, due to the fact it's very simple, right? So if you want to have an Oracle DBA, right? So it takes years of training, right? So after they come from college, well, typically you would already find a 17-year-old who has worked already with MySQL or with MongoDB or with his project before he goes to university because it interests him. So you get people with experience already at a very young age, which can give you actually that velocity also to find people, right? So, yeah.
One of the things I think is interesting is you mentioned security, but also compliance, right? So compliance is a big piece. And how do you think that using, open source versus a locked-in vendor can help you achieve like the check mark in terms of the compliance part?
I would say portability, right? Having options, flexibility, all of these things. To be honest, this is a huge conversation I have pretty much every day, especially now that we've got DORA and the UK Op-Res rules live. I guess DORA went live a couple weeks ago, last week. Somebody tried to send me flowers or something and I laughed. And I think it's that optionality, right? It's flexibility. We've seen the trends go from having a 30-year contract with somebody to now wanting a pay-as-you-go service. We see that with public cloud computing. We see that with everything, right? And part of that is also having the ability to pivot if you want to use a different vendor, if you want flexibility in the tools that you use, if you want to be able to use different services, for example. And I think, to Dimitri's point, a lot of that also is about. One of the trends I see when I speak with CIOs as well is that how do you find people that want to work on this stuff? There's a whole lot less people that want to work, and I do work at Red Hat, which is owned by IBM. There's a whole lot less people that want to work on COBOL than there are in other languages, right? And that's a fact. So it's kind of all of the same sort of macro trends. I would always shy away from saying there's a compliance tick box because I think compliance is a continuum rather than a tick box. But those sorts of things, the flexibility, the interoperability, which I know is something huge at Finos looks at, the standardization of things so that people have choice and that you have a workforce that is engaged and wants to continue to work on it. Those are all like kind of macro themes that ultimately will help a firm be compliant and also help a firm be resilient.
And I think the project at Finos is the SD3.
Yep.
SD3. And then another thing, since we're talking about cloud, is that they've got the CCC, which is the Common Cloud Controls Project, which is reference architecture. And I think that is something that I'd like for you guys to touch on is like, how do foundations help financial institutions do this? Like where do you see a win and where do you see maybe room for improvement?
I'm going to kind of touch on that, but I sort of want to go back to the compliance and the security bit and the whole cost effectiveness of open source. So, as Monica mentioned, compliance is not a tick box. Like, it's not like there's a magic button that you press or a module that you install and you're suddenly compliant. It is a continuum, and whether it's PCI SOX or any of the other things, they all have different requirements. And I'm not particularly sure that there is any specific thing that makes open source necessarily better or worse in that space. one of the things, though, that I think people have to understand and go in eyes open is that, you know, open source isn't free. You know, you're swapping spending money on vendors to spending money on building a platform team and maintaining it, and, you know, figuring out how to do the security patching and everything like that. And you know, you do have to, I guess, build up a lot more of those internal programs to be compliant and to, you know, to match the requirements for, you know, updating all of the software every 3 months to be PCI compliant or whatever, or having support agreements to be SOX compliant or whatever. And I think that is a challenge that you know, all the financial organizations have gotten to grips with over the years. Because you mentioned hiring, but I think, you know, most fintechs are almost entirely tech organizations. Most investment banks are at least 30 to 40% tech organizations. And those organizations are modernizing. There's a lot of legacy, but there's you know, a lot of modern development going on, and you can't hire people who won't have, you know, who are going to just work on the legacy stuff. That's impossible. And the other thing is, coming back to the compliance, it's always a very tight compromise. You know, I kind of find in finance, the rate of innovation is very, very high because one organization gets an innovative break, a new product, a new feature, a new service, and they typically get 6 to 9 months head start, and then everybody has it. You know, it's a great leveling effect. So I think, you know, they're looking at how do I get those compliance through the platforms that they're building internally in order to support open source, because that gives them that innovative leapfrog over their competitors.
So since we're talking about talent and we kind of hinted at innovation already, so I was doing some research, and according to a Forbes article from December of last year, it said tech workers are flocking to financial services. It states that banks are building robust tech departments, which is what you just said. So yes, you're 100% on trend. So here are some of the things that I found real interesting. So Capital One and Bank of America secured positions among the top 15 companies obtaining AI and utility patents. Again, banking institutions have AI and utility patents. Citigroup expanded its workforce by adding 8,000 technologists between 2022 and 2023. And coming from the US and the land of layoffs in tech, you know, that is something to see why tech people are moving towards finance. And then JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Wells Fargo, Deutsche Bank, and Goldman Sachs are deploying AI and machine learning within its businesses already. So, all that being said, with this investment in talent and AI, where do we see advances in the open source world to help move this forward?
So essentially, you know, in the open source world, there's, of course, frameworks and solutions that they can develop. In the database world, it's mostly integrations, vector databases that can essentially be the backend for your integration, right? Where does it So banks typically, well, I know my Belgian banks, I worked at a bank before, right? So our goal is typically to personalize experiences, right? So to make sure that people essentially want to adopt you as an organization. And one of the items that they try to integrate quite heavily is AI. And they can rely on those open source solutions to essentially make sure that they have a library of data, right? So that they can access. And what you see is that there's a tailored approach in regards to how that mobile application, for example, will respond to you. So I have a practical example, right? So with us in our with one of my banks that I use, is they have something called Kate, which is the AI assistant, right? So essentially, yeah, you know my bank, they're a big Red Hat customer. So essentially, they use they specifically used backend library, right? So I know the technology stack a little bit based on open source solutions. And what they are trying to do is make sure that people immediately have access to their insurance documentation, et cetera. And based on there, and the thing is, the interaction is so seamless that the idea is that the moment that you start up, you actually see what you typically need, and it adapts itself. So, and that's what I also hear from my customers is, well, we want that flexibility in using some open source platforms, especially in AI, also because they don't always trust the cloud solutions that exist out there because it's sensitive information. So they want something which is locally on-premise to make sure that they have those tailored approaches. Of course, it's also used for fraud detection and other things, but yeah, that's my personal experience with the tool itself. But of course, practically, that's also, in the open source space, in databases, you have solutions that can help you with the integration itself. And sometimes it's easier for organizations to use, especially if they have an open source strategy, to focus on these open source solutions than buy something off the shelf. Because the question is also not like where's your data, right? So your data is still hosted typically for banks by themselves, right? But it's also like who is responsible for the responses you're getting, right? So, and who is responsible for that integration? So how will you do that from a compliance perspective? How is that legally, right? So because in the past you had a person giving you advice, now you have an AI backend answering you, right? So anyway, a lot of items in there.
No, I know, Kate. I think those are really good examples where we've already seen, and I mean, I remember being at Deutsche 5-6 years ago, and those are real use cases that we were actually deploying globally. And I think those are some of the hyper-personalization piece is a really big thing, and that is very personal, and that's where you start to see that mix of taking some open source software and then kind of almost making it yours so that it works in your context as a firm. That's your competitive advantage, and I think that's where you kind of get the best of all of the worlds to service you and actually all of us. Who am I kidding? To service all of us. The liability piece we'll talk about later because I don't think that's part of this conversation. It would probably bore lots of people. But I think one of the interesting things that I kind of come at this question from a different angle, and that's actually around the open sourcing of the models themselves. I mean, as we move into more of these deeper models, right? You touched on it, Dimitri. Fraud, that's been going on. Anything predictive analytics has been going on for a very long time. You've got quants in the investment banking side, which you touched on, I'm sure you know quite intimately based on your experience at Goldman's. This stuff has been around for a long time in financial services. Probably hasn't been fun to talk about because tech wasn't sexy 20 years ago, 10 years ago. I don't know. When did tech start being sexy? I don't know. And now it is. Yay. So those things have already existed. I actually think the power moving forward is going to be in the open source models, right? And not only is that going to be, I'm coming at it from an ethics point of view, right? That's going to really kind of, I guess, force people to look at them and critically and go, is there bias in this? Is this creating bias? Is this getting us the right answer that we need so that actually the liability piece wouldn't even matter, right? To make sure that you're getting the right decision, that actually the decision being given to Monica really should be for Dimitri. And I think that's where you're going to start to see the power of these things come to the fore.
So there's two things I want to touch on. I think, and this is kind of the benefit of seeing patterns due to old age, but we've seen sort of large seismic technology changes over the years. Whether it was the internet and the e-commerce boom, or the move to VMs, or the adoption of web for everything. But each of those had a critical point where there were a couple of factors that came together, typically a problem, and then it was solved by open source. So if you look at, say, the boom in the late 90s, early 2000s, you had every single data center full of Sun servers and HP servers and digital servers, and then you had a crash, and then over 2 to 3 years, 50% of all of those data centers were Compaq and Linux. And you had a similar thing going to, VMs and then various open source cloud virtualization technologies. Unfortunately, around the time of 2008, 2009, when we had the financial crash, and that was a big driver, And I'm kind of here to predict that actually almost everything we know about AI today is going to look completely different in 2 to 3 years' time, and we are about to see that crash. And I don't think it's a coincidence that, you know, DeepSeek as an open source AI model came out of a finance organization, a hedge fund. And so that's why open source is going to drive the innovation here. But I will also touch on the last point you mentioned around, you know, being able to understand the models better and things like that. You know, I think one of the things that I'm incredibly scared about with AI, and there are lots of things to be scared about, but one of the things I'm particularly scared about is sort of the concept of having models which are poisoned. You know, sorry, models which might be poisoned. You know, because there is so much complexity in the training that if you have some, you know, biased data or some intentionally malicious data in the early part of the training, by the time you get to the later stages of the model, you don't know. You know, you might have a mortgage application and the computer is going to say no, and you don't know why, and you can never know why, and it will always say no to you. You know, and that is worrying, and I think that is also what's going to drive some of the open sourcing of not just the models but the training data, so that there can be more scrutiny on those things, because honestly, there is there are lots of technologies which are black boxes, but this has to be one thing that can't be a black box going forward.
Black box. Oh, yeah. Sorry. And the EU AI Act is going to make sure that it's not just a black box, and including the training data. They've put limits on however many terabytes or petabytes of data were used, then you need to follow this path. If you use this, then you do that. Because it wants to make sure that the data is as unbiased as possible.
And it's interesting that you mentioned that because, you know, I think Amanda during the panel this morning also said that, you know, it's not just about like policymakers being in one room and open source, you know, being in another room. It's everybody having, as in the world of open source, a seat at the table to be able to help direct a policy so that it isn't, to Dan's point, completely unusable because it's so restrictive. So I think that is, you know, something hopefully that will become more recognizable, is that, you know, there's a holding of hands and not just a wagging of fingers at people like, oh, you did this wrong, or, oh, you made this wrong policy. So we'll see, right? Like it's, go ahead.
But to that point, and again, this is my opinion, I don't think like we're going to win the battle and make things good by regulating it. We're going to win it by having it more open and having more community eyes on this thing. You know, in much the same way that's how we've secured core infrastructure and cloud native technologies and the Linux kernel and things like that.
I think with anything, it comes back to the 80-20 rule, right? So you have to be able to have humans intervene somehow. If, for example, I keep getting rejected for a mortgage, which would be ridiculous because I'm the perfect person to give a mortgage to, you know, low to value ratio, live in central London, double income, no kids. If the computer keeps saying no, you have to be able to have a break in the process, and I think that's where the rubber is going to meet the road with how people start to implement it, is how they can ensure that a human gets in the middle somehow. And I think that's where it's going to get interesting, and I think actually you're right, I kind of 100% in line with you. I think we're going to have a little bit of a bursting of the bubble, and then it's going to come back a lot more sensibly.
Anything? Okay. No? No. Okay. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, here are some facts. So according to the 2024 State of Open Source in Financial Services report conducted by Finos, GitHub contributions from financial services professionals are up 26% over last year. 84% of respondents report spending work time contributing to third-party open source, which is up from 41% in 2021. And to me, I think the most eye-opening finding was that 50% of respondents agree that OSS use would increase with better understanding of the non-technical value proposition of open source software or OSS. So we touched on it a little bit, but how do we work to change or evangelize the value proposition of OSS to get more adoption and innovation in the finance industry, but also to share what's happening in the finance industry to those of us at home that have no idea, like what's going on?
So I think, one of the items that we're always, I'm a technical person, right? So essentially what we're always pretty good at is giving technical explanations, but we're very bad at giving business explanations, right? So business impact. For organizations to, nobody's ever got fired by hiring Oracle or something like that in the past. Ideas, maybe nowadays, but essentially for us, what we need to do to make sure that, for example, there's more open source adoption, is to make sure that that decision makers essentially understand what the value of choosing an open source technology in regards to flexibility, innovation, can bring to them, but on practical terms, right? So making sure they actually have a business case from another user, right? So I give an example, right? So in other tech industries, but for example, those use cases from Uber in regards to how they use their database technologies and how it leverages their capabilities or augments their capabilities. If they have business cases, they can better also, because there's always different decision makers, and typically it goes up to the CIO, they can typically influence that better compared to just saying like, well, we got a 3% increase in regards to performance. That doesn't give them anything. So we really need to be better at giving them real, the business impact of moving towards open source. That's, I would say, probably one item that would be make it easier.
It's kind of almost a trick question, I'll be honest, because it's, again, if you look at if you look at software projects in general, across the board, and this is the same for finance, something like 95% plus of all software projects have some level of open source, and in almost every project, it averages around 70% of the code is open source. So I don't think the question isn't what do we do to increase adoption or to get the adoption. Everything is adopted. I think the question is the quality and how we also take the lessons learned from adopting open source and apply it to other parts of the business. So for example, just about every finance organization has consumed open source. Some of them help contribute back to that open source and fix bugs or whatever. And a smaller number, and this is typically fintechs, will actually donate entire projects that they've just worked on. And a lot of those projects might be, things like API libraries or software libraries to build the applications, but they might also be, this is how you do open banking and integrate into Visa, for example, and it allows all other banks to integrate. And you kind of wonder, well, why would they want to do that? And the answer is because it removes a bunch of obstacles for their customers, right? Everybody, it's just nice to be able to pick any bank and just be able to make transfers to anybody else, right? And then there is also the final point I'll say, which is one of the things that I think a lot of companies could look to do better is insourcing. So applying the lessons of open source to their own internal organizations. And actually, funnily enough, that can be harder, right? Because we have so many organizations split into so many teams and so many silos with individual budgets, each of them developing over and over the same technology, figuring out how to manage secure data, figuring out how to do data management, figuring out how to do access control, figuring out all of these different things. And actually, if those internal teams started sharing their source code between each other, even internally within the company, that would be revolutionary, and that would drive innovation. But of course, that's when you get into the, well, it's my budget, I built it with my team, why should I share it? And if I share it, does that mean I get a smaller team next year, et cetera, et cetera. So those are some of the, the pragmatic challenges in adopting the innovation.
I love the inner source piece. That's something we're very passionate at Red Hat, and we do work actively with our clients in financial services on exactly that topic. I think one of them actually was at Finos last year in New York, Lloyd's, talking about inner sourcing, and gosh, I remember working on that program. I'm going to kind of take it up a couple levels. As I said, I joined Red Hat from the business side of the bank, which actually filled me with a lot of imposter syndrome when I joined Red Hat, because you can imagine going from the business side of the bank over to Red Hat was, yeah, exactly, it was very different. Don't worry, now I know all the stuff I need to know. But I think there's a huge gap, and this probably is not just in financial services, it's probably in any big company, with knowledge and education. And I'll tell you two stories I think that might make some people cringe. The first one was my personal story. When I delivered this big program, I was the head of regulatory change at Deutsche Wealth, and I delivered a massive program. If anybody worked in banks, I delivered MiFID II, right? When it was all over, I said to the CEO, yeah, exactly. How I'm still alive is beyond me. I went to the COO afterwards, and I said, listen, we really need to get rid of the bloody wall between IT and the business. I would go to my IT colleague and I would say, hey, can you give me an update on A, B, and C? Yeah, sure, it's amber. Mate, that is not a freaking update, that's a color. And he said, you don't need to know what you're the business. And I said, I bloody well do, because I have to go to the CEO and swear on my dead grandma's grave that we're compliant so we can open up the trading floor on Monday morning. So can you please give me more than a color, right? No, I got another color. Guess what? We went live with 99 manual workarounds. That's the impact of IT and the business not talking. Wow. So I went to the COO and I said, listen, can I go do some time in IT? I want to kind of learn this stuff. And do you know what he said to me? It's going to take you off the MD track. Peace out, I came to Red Hat.
Boom.
Fast forward, I was having a cocktail with one of my mentors, and she said to me, oh, you'd be so proud of me, Monica. And I said, why? And she said, I approved the cloud. And I said, what? And this kind of goes back to my education piece. And I said, well, what can you tell me what you mean you approved that? She was a chief risk and compliance officer at a big bank in the city. And I said, what did you approve? Just tell me a little bit more. So she kind of told me stuff. And I said, do you have any idea what you signed up for? And she said, well, no, my CTO said it was blah, 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 and blah. I said, your CTO is a religious tech geek who doesn't actually know what he's talking about. And so I do think that there's a gap in education at that senior level. And it's not because people aren't smart. It's because, you maybe have come up through a different part of the business. You've got 20, 30 years in risk or in trading or whatever. Pick whatever topic, right? Now, guess what? Tech is ubiquitous. We have to know about it because the decisions that you make or we make impact the entire business. And nobody really knows that. And add that to, you have technologists, and I love technologists. I call myself a business technologist. I think it's great fun, actually. But everybody can be religious. We're all here religious about open source. That's why we're here today, right? You have people that are religious about not open source. So you have to kind of find a way to educate yourself and educate everybody around you to kind of remove that religion piece. And I know now I'm talking a little bit esoterically, but I do think that's how we can kind of get everybody on the same page so that we get the right outcome for the business and its customers and its clients, and frankly, all of us, because we all use these banks. We all consume the fintech products because the banks are partners with them. So it's kind of all one big circle. And when you start to think about it like that, it kind of changes people's perspectives.
It's interesting because we talked about interoperability between, software, but I think this is something that it's kind of a hill that I'm trying not to die on, but the interoperability between foundations and the projects within those foundations, right? Like, so I happen to sit on like a bunch of different, like from the LF to CNCF to CDF to OpenSSF, and then there's like Oasis and there's Eclipse and there's all these different foundations that are working on projects that are all within the financial services industry. But if you don't understand how one is working with the other, or that one even exists, then, I mean, you don't know what you don't know. So you have a bunch of technologists in different little silos working on the same problems that might be having the same issues, because as much as we're sharing, we're not sharing. So I think that whole gap isn't just in the education level on like telling people from the top like why this is important, but it's also on the developer level saying, hey, we're all working on the same thing. Can we talk to each other? Can we like figure this out?
And not on Slack.
Yeah, and not on Slack. Can we get this in person or something?
And you know, I love the fact that you touched on the religious side of things and the hill. because that is the one thing actually that terribly annoys me about open source. There's too much religion, and there's a bit of a cult thing. You know, software has to be sustaining, but in order for anything to be sustaining and for it to be successful, it has to deliver what it needs to deliver today, whilst, you know, paving a path towards the future. And I think, you know, the key to latch onto, and the people that become the biggest enablers are in fact the people who bridge the business to the technology and vice versa, and not necessarily the people who are those, you know, CTO sort of very narrow scope focus, because, you know, ultimately none of this matters if you can't make the business work, if you can't pay the salaries, if you know, if the business isn't profitable, right? Nothing is worth doing just for the sake of doing it. It has to be viable now.
You have to make money.
Yeah.
Nobody needs a mic to hear me.
No, I agree. So I think also like, you know, it is nice if it's open source, but it doesn't need to always, right? So, and I've been in situations also where customers say to me like, okay, well, we have in financial industries that said like, well, we have these large Oracle deployments. We would like to migrate to Postgres. And I'm like, what's the value for you to do that? Because as you said already, open source is not free, right? So, okay, it's nice from a licensing perspective, but yeah, it will take you a long time, right? Potentially to migrate. So you need to actually map all the functions, see what specifically will be the cost to migrate. And that's often something that, yeah, especially the technology side of a company actually forgets, right? So, and sometimes they give conflicting information upstream, right? And that's then the solution architects typically inside their organization that will make the right decision and advise the CIO. But for, yeah, sometimes it's not the right decision, especially if you want it now. But yeah.
But on that point, it's always a distinction between what is the core technology that's a differentiator for your company, right? It's kind of okay if you are using a SaaS service, or you're paying for a product, or, you know, if it's not your core stack, you know, absolutely focus on your business and focus on building your actual services that are going to make you money. However, you know, what I would say is banks, probably more than most, the tech is the differentiator. You know, whether it's the latency, the intelligence, the interconnectivity, you know, all of those different things are the differentiator. And sometimes, and most of the time, I think when you see a finance organization adopting the technology, you know, cost is obviously a factor, because cost is always a factor in a finance organization, but the enabling tech that it gives you is what makes that switch, and that's what the CIO is going to need to focus on.
Okay, so we have 30 seconds for each of you. and we're going to do like a Jerry Seinfeld moment, like what, or not Jerry Seinfeld, Jerry Springer, his final thoughts. So I think we could talk for a really long time, and I know that our questions were kind of across the board, but I think this is a really interesting topic that doesn't get a lot of maybe love. Hallway track, if you guys know what that is, if you find any of these people outside, feel free to dig in deep with them. I'm pretty sure they would like to have conversations, and if not, oops. Okay, so 30 seconds, lasting thought. We'll just start with you, Dimo.
Okay, yeah, sorry, I was not able to think about that yet, but essentially from my perspective, yeah, I think open source is alive in the financial industry, right? So there's no doubt about that. I would say in the past there were some hesitance, especially from compliance perspective, right? So there were always some discussions with security people, right, surrounding, well, the transparency, which is typically one of the big factors, the positive factors in open source solutions. Next to that, but there has been adoption, right? So I was there when one of the organizations you know well, right? So was adopting Red Hat Enterprise Linux for the first time. And it went into, it speeded up incredibly, like a roller coaster in regards to these types of industries. So it's there. There can be more, right? So sometimes I still notice hesitance in regards to, especially migrating towards those types of technologies, and also because banks typically are risk averse. They are technology savvy and they innovate, but they're risk averse. And sometimes it takes them time to actually invest in some sort of technologies that are more open source focused. So yeah, nothing else.
I made some notes, so I'm just going to read them. I think open source is the solution to solving. There we go. That's our. You need to leave now. No, it's fine. I think it is the solution to solving some of the most challenging resilience problems that we are seeing and experiencing today. If you live in the UK and you bank at Barclays, they told you to go to a food bank recently. Yeah, fact. And Lloyd's as well. And it's not just in financial services, it's other industries. I do think that's the way to solve some of these resilience challenges that we're all experiencing. And at the end of the day, keeping the tech lights on is no longer a competitive advantage. It's actually critical in keeping our financial and our economy systems up and running so that we can all benefit.
Yeah, it's the open source basically enables us to maintain a high rate of change whilst not having everything crash down around us. And I'll finish on just one point. Given that open source, every large open source adoption was preceded by a huge crash, here's fingers crossed, everybody, that over the next 2 years we don't have a massive crash as open source eats AI.
Okay, well, I would love to thank Alex, Monica, and Dimo. Thank you all for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of OpenCon.